Thank you, Matthias. And I hope you all are, the words from Cynthia, from Gladwell, from Tom, from Kirsten, David, everybody are still resonating in your heads, because what I will talk about connects with all of that, or all of what has been said in amazing ways. Imagine for a moment that your son or your mother or your loved one is having trouble breathing, and you need to take them to the hospital. And upon entrance in the hospital, someone tells you, you cannot go in because of corruption, not because of incompetence or because of scarcity, but because of corruption. There's not enough oxygen or intensive care units for your loved one, so you cannot go in. And imagine in that anguish, your loved one cannot breathe. You're told to wait until people find those responsible of those acts of corruption, so that someone at the end of that process, they can provide your loved one with oxygen and can breathe again. That sounds absurd, but that's actually what we're out for. That's actually what is happening a lot these days. And that's something that we have to avoid happening. We're looking out for a world that is with a lot of enforcement, with a lot of transparency, with a lot of effort for prevention, but absolutely no justice. And this is something that is greatly missing from the political declaration. No surprise, it's a political declaration. But it stops short. It stops short not only of making a really revolutionary new statement about updating its circumstances to the 21st century, but it's also stopping short of really delivering to citizens what they're missing and what's been taken away from them because of corruption cases. This is what we mean when we say that the consequences of corruption need to be dealt with. We're very focused on the perpetrators, on the causes, on the circumstances, on the systems, on the processes, on the lack of information, but we're leaving the consequences of that corruption to bear on the citizens and on the companies that have been bearing them for long. Reparation of the damages caused by corruption means actually ensuring that all those public goods and services reach those citizens. What will be the point of having much more enforcement, much more transparency, much more tools to fight corruption if we're actually not going to deliver justice? And this is what justice means. And bear with me, I'm not saying by any way that enforcement or prevention or transparency are not necessary. Quite the contrary. Just like Gladwell, they're very much necessary. But they're stopping short because we're leaving kids without schools or without meals. We're leaving people without healthcare. We're leaving companies without contracts that normally, if their rivals had not behaved badly, they could have been assigned to them. So fighting corruption, leaving those consequences untouched, is not a good way to fight corruption. And particularly is a very contradictory way by the UN, on one hand, to push a 2030 agenda with social development goals to achieve. And on the other hand, to say, but you know what, we're going to focus only on, in fighting corruption, we're going to focus only on finding the perpetrators and in trying to prevent it. And part of the issue is, and what is missing, what I find really missing in the political declaration, is putting people at the center, putting citizens at the center. And that goes through a lot of what Gladwell, what Tom, what Cynthia also say. And particularly when they're mentioned with exactly the same Samantha used an interesting word, vague qualifiers. So within our means, we will consider inviting or involving citizens, companies, journalists. The citizens are at the center. They're not there to be invited. They're in the middle. Citizens are at the beginning and at the end of fighting corruption. So it's not just about involving them, but it's also about ensuring that fighting corruption translates into something, into improving the lives and the well-being of citizens. If we're not doing that, if we're not achieving that, we're achieving very little. In that sense, I also agree with what has been said in terms of the little vision of the declaration, at least the text I saw, because I understand it's evolving in time. But the text that I saw is not really, there's not much to criticize about it. You read it and you find it okay, but it's missing. It's totally missing addressing the consequences of corruption. It's absolutely nowhere to be seen. Well, it's mildly mentioned in the chapter concerning asset recovery, but reparation is not an issue of asset recovery. Reparation is an issue of when corruption happens in and outside of asset recovery, in and outside of litigation, in national litigation, in international litigation. So it's really not mentioned. And yet, the convention actually already established long ago. We don't need the political declaration to reinstate or reword something that the convention already said. The convention established that the consequences of corruption need to be dealt with, and established as mandatory to all those signatory countries that the damages, that the people and entities entitled to damage compensation can have access to that justice. In fact, various reviews conducted by UNODC on behalf of the UNCAC bodies confirmed that countries are fulfilling their obligations within these two articles. So there's not really much to do about laws, and there's not much to do about texts. What needs to be done is actual action. There are a few countries who are already starting to include reparation within their corruption cases, either as prosecutors or as victims. None of these cases is absolutely perfect, but there's a lot of great efforts already going out there. What I want to emphasize also is, what does it mean to put people at the center and to address the consequences of corruption? This means that people have the right to stand before a tribunal of justice and demand the collective reparation of the damages that corruption causes, just like it happens with human rights abuses or with environmental damages, which, by the way, corruption is one of the main means of committing both of them. So there's not really a definition or a difference between those. There's countries also doing a lot of good things. For example, there's, with great leadership, France just approved in a fast track decision by its assembly, that the assets confiscated in France can be delivered back for the benefits of the citizens of the countries where those assets were originated from. So they're already opening the way for reparation, in that case through asset recovery, but also through the recovery of proceeds of crime in the case of France. You wonder, when it comes to the declaration, I saw that, I think it was David, the paragraph 20 and 21st of the declaration talk about protection of citizens and journalists, etc. But it stops there. It stops one step beforehand. The declaration is saying the citizens can enact cases, but it's not talking about what is needed and what is actually happening in many countries, which is that citizens are actually taking a stand in those tribunals and bringing cases and requesting and demanding reparation of collective damage. So I do feel that in that sense, the declaration not only has a huge vacuum in terms of reparation and addressing the consequences of corruption in general, but also is stopping short, is stopping one step before it should be. It's actually puzzling because when I read the declaration, I found it creates a lot of fear. It's all about the grave and the deep and the terrible consequences of corruption and the need to make awareness and to share information about the damages, terrible damages that corruption causes, but not a single thing about how to really fix it or how to really address the consequences. So in that sense, I find the political declaration also not enough. I may not have too much hope on a political declaration, though, because we all know we're facing an assembly of countries that have very different views about what justice means, about what the world should look like. So we're waiting at looking at a common denominator that can only go much below the expectations of what the actual world really needs. So I'm not too hopeful as many others of you. In that sense, I'm also with Gladwell in underscoring the lack of vision. But I'm also underscoring very much the lack of reality, because the world changed already. The world changed, and we're in a world where the citizens are at the center, where this is not an international space without citizens, without companies, without academia, without journalists. It's not really a proper space for discussion, debate, and production of necessary tools. So
Juanita, sorry, you need to come to an end, please, because we're slowly running out of time.
I will. So coming to what would be needed, what we need to see is a more clear statement about the need to address the consequences of corruption. We need to see more action. Yes, a good declaration would be fine, but even without a good declaration, we can do a lot because the text is already there. More prosecutors leading claims to adjudicate reparation, and more judges actually also adjudicating reparation. Government entities addressing reparation on time, not until the responsible have been found, but repairing that damage as it passes. The obligations of the states to deliver goods and services and to protect human rights are not conditioned to the absence of corruption in any constitution of this world. So there's no need to wait for that. And we need more and more citizens bringing claims for collective reparation into the tribunals. And those rights need to be secured, protected, and respected, which in many countries, unfortunately, are not. What we can also do is to hold states accountable for their international obligations. The states that have signed the UNCAC Convention have committed themselves to enable the participation of civil society in this, and also have committed to reparation. So we will make sure, and that is something I invite all of our organizations to increase efforts into demanding collective reparation for the damages that corruption causes. One last thing is that
one last sentence, please.
That I have that Matthias didn't mention is that we have in the coalition a working group of victims of corruption where we regularly meet, encourage each other, exchange lessons learned and practices. So those of you not still participating from those meetings, you're all invited to participate. Thank you, Matthias.